Thank you, Fermin, and great being again in Copenhagen. Always a pleasure, and to see so many friends. Now, this format is very new for me as well. I think we saw before. I saw the previous presentation, and you did twice. But so let's try. Usually, we present our work and what is behind, and so I decided to start with growing up. I grew up in Italy, and I spent a number of years in the countryside. I also had a little bit of kind of hippie upbringing in the countryside, and with an organic farm in this place in the Monferrato in Piedmont, in the hills where you make wine and so on. And then something that always inspired me is a quote by Carlo Scarpa, who says, "Tra un albero e una casa, scegli l'albero. Between a tree and a house, pick the tree." And that was Carlo Scarpa, one of the greatest architects of the past century. And it is true. If you look at a tree is magic. Look at a tree, it's better than any of us can do. The tree is actually getting all the energy it needs from the sun, getting all the material it needs from the earth. And this does this beautiful architecture, and then when it's over, it all goes back in a circular way. So we are struggling to do something that's very primitive versus what nature does. Well, granted, nature had a long time to this. Nature had millions of years of evolution, but still, what we do is very primitive versus that. And the tree is also very close to the beginning of architecture. If you think about the Abbé Roger in 18th century France, his idea was that the beginning of architecture is, first of all, to protect us from climate, when climate is a bit hostile. Architecture starts when climate is hostile, and architecture might be needed more and more if you look at climate change and more extreme events. And he was saying that nature itself is appropriated by the architecture in order to create shelter and what he called the primitive hut. So I was passionate about that and about nature, and I said, well, what should I do? I didn't start with architecture. So I first went to engineering. I went to a place in Paris called École des Ponts. The École des Ponts is there's a number of reasons. École des Ponts is an engineering school in Paris. It also now recently it moved to another side, but it was in Rue de Saint-Père. It was an amazing place for partying and so on. It has the best engineering school community in the center of the city. But since the beginning, since the 18th century in France, the École des Ponts looked at nature and how to transform nature. So there's actually the logo of the school today comes from this drawing, but it was about looking at different things, roads and buildings and other things in order to work with nature. So I loved a lot doing research there, studying there at the beginning. This is actually something that one of my professors for my thesis did is Michel Villeroger with Norman Foster, did this kind of beautiful bridge in France. But then I couldn't find the tree I was looking for, the tree I started with. Somehow this is technology fighting nature, learning from nature, but somehow ultimately fighting nature like in 20th century architecture. So following that, I said, well, maybe in architecture, I can find the tree we started from. And so I went to Cambridge. And what I like about Cambridge, UK, not Cambridge, US, where I'm now, Cambridge, UK is that, first of all, nature is really embedded in the university fabric. This was my college, Darwin College. Also, Darwin, who discovered many of the laws of nature, but the space itself is a blend, you could say, of the natural and the artificial. And another thing I like about Cambridge is, in Cambridge, for instance, the place where I was at the time, had been started by a guy called Phil Stedman, who did a lot of work on how the natural and artificial follow similar rules. When you look at this, is how the evolution in the artificial space, the space of objects, of buildings, and so on, which goes back to Samuel Butler, who wrote at the time of Darwin, wrote a beautiful article called Darwin Amongst the Machines. So somehow how the artificial world, what we all design, objects and buildings and cities, follow similar rules to the natural one. So there I focused on cities. I studied cities, I did a lot of things with cities, but still I couldn't find the tree we started from. The tree of trying to look at that as a principle of how what we do can actually aim towards what nature does. And so then I ended up at MIT. I ended up at MIT, and there was a different approach. At MIT, I went to the place called the Media Lab at the beginning. They were started by Nicolas Negroponte, who over the years became a friend. And Nicolas, one of the first projects he did was actually this project, putting technology and animals together. I think it was in the 1970s where we actually looked how the two could interact. We had a robotic system and animals, and how architecture and nature could blend in different ways. And of course, that went back to what Wiener did, think about cybernetics. I think I saw a few references to cybernetics before. When I got there, actually, it was exactly when Spielberg had just gone, and to actually get inspiration for Minority Report, and again, how the world of data could blend with the human world in a different way. That was actually what you see in the movie was what was developed at the Media Lab at the time. And that was starting to enter the space of buildings and cities. So with the Internet of Things, digital and physical, we're starting to blend and create kind of a new possibility. So we started working at the beginning. These are not our projects. I'm not allowed to show any project, but we did some of the things we're doing, and I was somehow involved was about looking at new interfaces to play with data and physical things. Tangible Media Group was doing a lot of work in this. Or also at the beginning, looking at how digital could turn our buildings, our objects, our cities into living things. So maybe that was another way to get closer to that tree we said at the beginning. Use sensors, use intelligence, artificial intelligence, use actuators in order to make a building that becomes like a living thing. And so that's what that was my initial TED Talk where we presented something. In architecture, it becomes alive, the senses and response. But probably that was not the whole story. That was one way to go towards nature, but also there are many other ways. And if you think about it, it's about the natural and the artificial, how we can use intelligence, artificial intelligence to turn a building into a living thing, but also how we can use nature itself as a building block for what we do. And so, of course, this is Emilio Ambas, this is Stefano Boeri in Milan, this is Ecologic Studio looking at this, but somehow how the other way we can use nature as part of what we can use in our daily practice. So anyway, I still didn't find a tree, but I think that is probably the biggest and the most beautiful challenge we all have, which is almost a co-evolution between the natural and the artificial world. So how architecture can look at that and integrate the two worlds. You saw at the beginning is from the artificial to the natural, using sensors and intelligence and so on, but also from the natural to the artificial, using nature itself as a teacher and as a building block for the built environment. So that's what I'm still trying to find, the tree. And one of the ways we are looking at today is through code. If you want, code is behind all of this. Code is the code of nature. Code is what makes us. It makes all the natural environment. Somehow, there's something common there if you want to go in that direction of finding the tree. Something that fascinates me right now is some of these things. Anybody knows what this is? Well, this is a community of bacteria. And believe it or not, bacteria make their own cities called biofilms. Here there were images just a few years ago, but there's a few people discovering that. But they create communities, organize, create little homes, and biofilms have many similarities with cities. So maybe that's a place where we can look at some of the solutions to find that tree. And we'll also look for the tree at the Venice Biennale next year. We call it intelligence. We use the Latin word, using the Venice Biennale has both the Italian and the English word. We decided to use the root because we like this idea of gens, that in Latin means people. So not one intelligence. You say intelligence, and people think about ChatGPT, and they think they know everything about it. Well, I think there's a lot of intelligence in the built environment, in the thousands of years of human evolution and how we made cities and buildings. And so that's what we want to look at in this collective intelligence, natural, artificial, and collective approach to, inclusive approach to intelligence. So I think I've been too fast. I was told no more than 30 slides, but I went quite fast. We'll have more time for discussion, but I added one slide here that was inspired by Kant today, and that's Le Corbusier. So architecture revolution. The real revolution will be this, I think, blending the natural artificial world. Thank you.
Each talk is different. And Carlo, we're very happy to have you here. You say that that when it comes to addressing climate crisis, architecture is our hope.
Yeah.
What do you think should be the role of architects in this fight?
Well, I think you could say two ways. One way is now we are starting to understand, we've been talking a lot about mitigation, how architecture can be more sustainable. That's super important. But I think we're getting a lot into the space of adaptation. And adaptation means that we have a small lab in Rio de Janeiro. In Rio de Janeiro, a few weeks ago, it was 65 degrees Celsius. Well, it was perceived temperature, so it was more like 40-something, plus humidity and so on. So when you get to the level, then architecture is really our hope in the sense that it can help mitigate some of the effect of, adapt to some of the effects of climate change. And, so in this sense, it's probably our main hope, how we can make our cities more livable facing a more extreme climate. And we saw before the Abbé Loger, the idea of the primitive hut. Well, architecture, as we were saying, starts when the climate is against us. So today, it becomes the most important response to a climate that might become more extreme in different ways.
And do you think that architects are properly trained to tackle the whole challenge? I mean, the
training,
the majority of.
I think the training is very important. Well, I've seen a huge change in like 10 years at MIT. If you look at people, MIT or...
But MIT is not all over, I mean, it's...
No, I'll tell you my experience. But I've seen a huge change in, interest of people and the training. And it's about, learning about programming, for instance, learning about people, learning about more open source and sharing things. So I think maybe we're not there yet, but I see a huge change that's happening.
Mm-hmm. And what is your hope for next year at next Venice Biennale? I mean, it must be a huge pressure at the same time as well on you. There's some hope.
Yeah, well, first of all, I was told no spoilers, so I cannot say anything. I'm under embargo, but I'll tell you just about the general principles. The first thing, the three types of intelligence. Today, if you think about universities, usually people dealing with natural intelligence don't talk much with people natural intelligence, looking at nature and natural materials. Don't talk much to people dealing with smartness. And those don't talk much to people dealing with the collective or networks. Well, I think there's a common thread behind all of them. The common thread is really about different type of intelligence, and we need all of that to face a climate that might become more extreme. So somehow one of the messages next year will be, let's work together in order again to, we are at the center of that. The only way we can make our cities more livable facing a more extreme climate is through design and architecture. So somehow, let's get together to tackle this.
Also, I have to think of one interview that I read of you that you say when you describe when you summarize your life, it feels like you're running the whole time. But when you summarize your life...
It's only because I was fast with the slides, but you told me no more than 30, and I usually run the slides fast.
But you say, you summarize your life in 3 words, saying, struggle for change. What did you mean by that? Do you remember that interview? Or what did you mean by that?
Well, struggle for change, I think, change is natural evolution. Nature tries new things. And we as architects are part of that process. If you think about what nature does, when you think about mutation in nature, in a tree or something, that's about trying something new. That can be a failure, can be a success, but that's it. And I think we are kind of accelerator of the same process in the artificial world. So somehow, change is positive. It's a way we can get to new things, and it's really embedded, I would say, in our DNA and in the DNA of everything that's around us.
And what has been your biggest struggle in order to change?
It's a good question. Sorry. It's a good question. I think sometimes, there's this kind of tension. On the one hand, change is how we can innovate. We can find something new. But also when you get institutions, they are very averse to change. When you can think about legislation and so on. So there's this kind of struggle. It's really a strong struggle. If you think about Buckminster Fuller, who was a great architect and inventor in the US in the past century, he has a terrible sentence in one of his books. The book is Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth. And what he says is, wars are good because then you change and try a new word. And nature does, that's terrible. Nature does the same sometimes. Nature has many species who actually are the first one to colonize after the fire. When you go to the forest, somehow you start again with a new ecosystem. Now, I think, so somehow there's also this resistance that basically you get interest groups. There's something else that, economist Mansur Olsen has been writing in the past century as an economist, that basically in society you get interest groups, and clearly they want to protect the status quo, and so they don't want innovation. And I think so sometimes institutions, governments, and so on would be against innovation. We need to find a way to innovate without ending up with what Bucky Fuller said, without having to destroy the whole system.
But is there any personal moment where you had a kind of a shift?
A personal moment, no, I can tell you, but it happens many times. When when you see that, well, I'll tell you, maybe something to mention is also that's a little bit like a cultural thing. And for instance, there's many places in the world where people want to be innovative. And I sometimes say there's some countries, I will not, where it happened to us, we came with a project, they liked it, they say it's innovative, yes. And then they say, well, at the end of the meeting, they say, well, can you tell me just how many times you've done it before? I say, well, if you've done it before, it's by definition, it's not innovative, right? But they're very risk averse. Well, for instance, if you go to Dubai, for instance, there's things you might like or not like. But one interesting thing is that they ask you the same question, say, have you done it before? If you say yes, they don't want it anymore. So somehow there's also some cultural things in the way people want to take risk in doing a project and want to be innovative or not. So those are some more personal things.
Now that you mentioned Dubai or Middle East, what do you? I was wondering the other day, what would you think of huge projects that we don't need to name the possible project, but that could be, that's so huge, so large that could be very, could create attention regarding also sustainability and what would be innovation, but at the same time also the challenges that will bring to the
look,
place.
I think new projects could be interesting because also you try new things, but always if you start from nature. I think I might be critical if there's a project that ignores nature and just tries to, like in the 20th century, to think architecture doesn't need to focus on the local environment. So that's the first thing. The second thing that's interesting is actually that if you look at population growth, well, population growth today is stalling. If you look at the world as a whole, and if you look, China announced a couple of weeks ago that population went down by almost 2 million, I believe. Japan is losing a bit less, between 500,000 and 1 million people a year. If you look at the whole world, if you look at population, in 30 years, it's going to go down as fast as it went up. Those things are exponential, so if fertility rate is 2.1, you're stable. If it is more than that, and like a few decades ago, South America was at 6, now is under 2.1. So those are exponential, so it goes down very fast. And another interesting thing that was mentioned before is, well, I believe that we don't need to, in Europe, in the US and South America, there's only parts of Africa and small pockets of Asia that keep on growing. But again, probably for just a few decades. I think what we need to do is not build more, certainly not use any more natural land for building, but more like rethink about what we have. So there's still a lot of work for architects. It's about starting from what we have, reuse a lot of the materials, and transform it into a better place for living. So that would be the...
One other question that I have for you is, you also mentioned in an interview that you had from your father the intolerance to conformism and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
You really looked at a lot of interviews and
prepare myself. How often do you see the mindset in the building industry, like this conformism and willingness to challenge the
first of all, let me tell you a little bit about about my father, because it links a bit to what we heard before. I think there's almost like a common thread, and the reason was on the countryside is that he opened one of the first organic farms in Italy after having done a PhD in the United States and so on. So and there was probably like common thread with what we heard before of this link to nature, maybe slightly hippie as well as an approach. And I think that is quite important, because then you don't take the status quo, as you said, what is there is a given, but you think how you can change it. And I think that's the principle. Somehow innovation comes when you struggle against what is there. And I think I probably lived some of that. At the beginning it's tough. At the beginning it's tough because it's much easier to go with the crowd or to follow things. But then at one point that becomes becomes fun. And then I think that's when innovation starts.
And do you see kind of a standard of that? Do you think architects and developers are playing too safe too often?
I think sometimes they are, but also, let me tell you a story. There's a very nice competition now, C40, the big association of cities, including Copenhagen, run every year, called Reinventing Cities. And I remember around 10 years ago, the vice mayor of Paris was a guy called Jean-Louis Misica. And Jean-Louis, and I had met Jean-Louis, and he was saying, I want to force developers to be more creative. He was annoyed that developers would follow the same, blueprint and do the same thing, repeat, clone the same, not innovative thing everywhere. So the city changed the rules and said they were going to allow a lot of projects in Paris. The first one was called Reinventer Paris, Reinventing Paris, but not based on other parameters, but starting from the level of innovation that the people will come out. Well, that changed a lot in the city, and now with C40, is changing a lot the principles. So I think sometimes, yes, not innovating is easy. You follow what you know, and you keep on doing the same. But I think it's also possible to change the rules of the game. And I think this thing that started Reinventer Paris became, because of its success, Reinventons la Métropole, so inventing the whole metropolis in Paris. And then through C40 became like this kind of global competition. And many of us have been involved in different ways with C40. Then I think is an example of how you can change the system just by changing the rules. And then people will adapt.
Now that you have mentioned the other speakers, I think it's a good time also to have the run-off discussion. So what Carlo, we are going to say is, for now, thank you, and ask you to have a seat for a second, and then we'll build up the round of discussion.
Thanks a lot.
So thank you, Carlo, for the nice talk.